Welcome to the CG Cookie course about creating clouds with Blender. Clouds are an example of volumetric shapes, which means they're entirely generated with shader nodes instead of polygon modeling. And even though volumes require notoriously long render times with cycles, Eevee makes cloud rendering practical. Thanks to Blender's cutting-edge Eevee render engine, we can generate, tweak, and perfect cloud volumes in basically real time. Across 8 lessons, you'll learn to use Blender's shader editor to create a simple cloud volume first. Then we'll increase the complexity with a detailed cumulus cloud, then wispy cirrus clouds, eventually building up a complete cloudscape. In the latter half of the course, we will transform the lighting into a sunset, and then explore how to animate our clouds. We'll create a time-lapse first, like you saw at the intro to this video, and finish with a fly-through, which reveals a nasty render artifact that I'll show you how to fix. By the end of this course, you'll be prepared to take to the skies and generate clouds of all shapes and sizes. We're going to begin this course with a simple cloud scene so that we can get used to the workflow before looking at the more complex applications. Because this is not a traditional modeling type of creation process, it's all based on the shader editor. We're not going to be pushing and pulling any verts, so right away we'll just switch to the shader workspace and spend all our time here where we generate our cloud structures completely with shader nodes. And since we won't be using any image textures, we can get rid of that workspace as well as the image editor so that we are just left with a 3D viewport and the shader nodes themselves. Now, as far as the objects in the scene, we're actually going to use everything from the default scene, including the cube, which I will select and rename clouds. And if you're wondering, how is this cube going to become a cloud? The reason is volumetrics interpret the cube as a domain. So the clouds will be formed inside the cube, which we'll get to in a little bit. But there are 3 main components when it comes to generating a cloud scene. Number 1 is going to be the world, which we can create now if I switch to the world context in our shader editor. Also, since this scene will be created entirely with shading nodes, the solid viewport and wireframe are not going to be that useful. Instead, we'll spend most of our time in the rendered viewport mode. This way, whenever I change the background color to a blue, like the sky, we see that update in real time. Obviously, we're using Eevee, which should be set to default, but if it's not, make sure you set that in your render settings. Now, as far as using a simple color for the entire sky, I don't recommend it from an artistic or really realistic perspective. Because if we open an image editor panel and then load our reference image, control space to maximize that view, this is the kind of scene we're going to create where we are grounded looking vertically towards the clouds. And the sky is not a solid blue. It's actually a gradient between variations of blue and sometimes even white. So if we hit control space to minimize the window, and I'm going to look at this bottom left image because it's going to most closely match our goal. And you can see that in the upper right, it's a darker, more saturated blue. And then as we go to the bottom left corner, the blue lightens and desaturates slightly. So we want to incorporate that kind of gradient into our world. We're going to do that with Shift-A texture, gradient texture. And while I'm thinking about it, I should enable my screencast keys so you can see what buttons I'm pressing. And with that gradient texture selected, I'm going to hit Control-T to create a texture coordinate and mapping node so we can move this texture around as we need. If you hit that hotkey and nothing happens, make sure you go to your preferences and the add-ons panel and look for Node Wrangler. This is pretty much a standard tool anytime people are using shader nodes in Blender, but it's not on by default, so just make sure you enable that. And then the hotkey Control-T should add these nodes automatically for you. And if we plug this now into the background node, it looks like the world goes completely black, but as we rotate around, we do see the gradient, but it is from left to right. We want it to be vertical rather than horizontal. So we need to use our mapping node to rotate I believe it's the y-axis. Yes, we want the black on the bottom, so we're going to rotate 90 degrees in the y-axis. Now that our gradient is vertically oriented, we can add a converter color ramp to easily change the beginning and end of our gradient as well as the colors. So we actually want the white to be at the bottom, and in the black we want to change to a bright vivid blue. And now if we look upward in 3D space, we can see that gradient towards the top. So let's drag the flag down. Also, I like to use B-spline as the interpolation method because it is a little smoother and you don't see those harsh fall-offs. Let's add another flag with control left clicking, and we'll make this a blue as well, but a lighter blue. That looks pretty good. And if you're looking directly at the cloud from the side, there's a bit of a disconnect in this scene because we would expect to see the earth, right? Mountains or landscape. So it looks weird to see the entire bottom be white, but remember, we're going to be looking at this cloud from the bottom. And so it's a good time now to position the camera by hitting 0 on the number pad. So we can see our camera by default is looking from above downward. So let's hit the N key to bring up our N panel, switch to the View tab, and enable Lock Camera to View. And I will simply navigate in the 3D view and look at the cloud from the bottom, okay? Disable Lock Camera to View, hide the N panel, and now we can adjust the gradient so that we see a darker blue at the top and it slightly gets lighter. In fact, I might add another flag at the top of the color ramp and make it a darker blue. There we go, something like that. Okay, now we've got a gradient as the background. And I also, personal preference, like to change the passepartout setting of the camera in the viewport display and change the opacity all the way up to 1. I find it very distracting to see my 3D scene beyond the camera frame. And so now I have a much clearer idea of what the camera will see. And so that is the first big component of the scene checked off the list, the world. Now the second thing is actually making our cloud cube a volume. So I'm going to select that object and now switch to the object context. And it's got a default material on it. Let's just change the name to clouds. And we can immediately get rid of the principled BSDF. So Control X, hit Shift A, and instead we're going to add a principled volume. And we're going to take the volume socket and plug it into the volume of the material output. Do not plug it into the surface. We're going to leave that one blank. And when you do that, you should see the volumetrics take effect. And it's constantly flickering every second or so. I find this only happens whenever I'm recording as well. So you shouldn't see the constant flickering, but it's just updating over and over again, trying to keep our scene in real time, which we will be able to make all of our changes in real time. It's part of the fun of working with Eevee. But that's why it's flickering. Now, as far as the color of the cloud, it's set by default to 0.5, which of course we want our clouds to be white. So I'm just going to select all those values and hit 1. And despite being at a color of 1, it's still gray in appearance. And this is because the world is not contributing enough light, nor is the point light that comes in the scene by default. So this brings us to the third component, which is a light object contributing light into the scene. We're going to switch the type to sun in our light object data. And the strength at 1000 is way too strong. You can see the cloud is absorbing way too much light. So we're going to bump that value down to 10 as far as the strength of the sunlight. Let's look in our camera view. And this should be a good orientation. It seems that the sunlight is kind of just showing down, which makes sense as the camera is looking from below. So at least the color of our cloud is white as we want it to be. However, you may notice that there's not any shadow information involved. That's because by default, if we jump to the render settings for Eevee, specifically under the volumetrics tab, volumetric shadows are disabled. So we want to enable that. And now you should see a little bit of shadow information. However, it's pretty faint still because the density of the cloud we need to adjust, but at least we have shadows enabled. And this panel, the volumetrics panel in our render settings, is a place we're going to spend a decent amount of time. So let's go over some important settings. Number 1 is the tile size. This accounts for the resolution of our volumetric domain. Put another way, the detail level of our clouds. So the higher this value, the lower resolution, the more blocky it looks. But the lower the pixel value, the crisper the details. And so we're going to render at 2, but for preview purposes, I recommend 4 pixels. And next we have the sample count for volumetrics, which is limited to 256. That's the highest that it goes. And you can see our cube cleared up quite a bit. Now, this is based on your graphics card, which I have, what is it called? The GeForce RTX 280, which as far as I know is like a mid to high range GPU. So 256 samples can work fine, but I'm gonna bump it down to 128 since I'm recording. You need to adjust this for your own PC. However, I do find that the tile size is more taxing. But once we render, we will bump the samples all the way up to 256. We'll come back to distribution in another lesson. Volumetric lighting enabled. I have never had to adjust the light clamping, but maybe we'll have to play with that as we get deeper into the course. Volumetric shadow samples. This is limited at 128. If you try and go above that, like 256, it'll bump back down to 128. And we will want to render at the highest value, but practically speaking, it's interesting that if you go lower, the shadows get darker and more noticeable. But that's just kind of something to keep in mind. We're going to be making our shadows darker by adjusting the density of the cloud. So that's an overview of the settings. We will, of course, come back to them. However, at this point, we have all 3 components we need to make a complete cloud scene. And now we're actually ready to make this cube look like clouds. So I'm going to select that object. And remember that since this is a domain and we're shooting for a type of cloud scene like this, we need to scale our cloud scene up to beyond the borders of our camera. Okay, so I'm going to scale that up until all I see is white cloud. Next, we're going to add the key texture node that makes it look like clouds, and that is texture noise texture. And then I usually like to add Control T for texture coordinate and mapping because it's common to adjust those settings, so it's nice to have them. And in this case, I will use the object coordinates for this texture and then plug the factor into the density, not the color value. Now, it doesn't look like anything happened, but that's only because our values are not strong enough. So if I hit Shift A and add a converter color ramp, and then drag the black flag up, we will start to see our clouds formed based on this noise. Now, if you've never used these textures to control a 3D volume, it might help to Shift Control click on any node to see how it's projected onto the cube exterior. And this is typically what you're looking at whenever you shade objects that aren't volumes. But what's cool about these textures is that they are also 3D. And so that's why they work in a volume. But if you ever want to check what the texture is doing, if it's not making enough of a difference in the volume, it's a good practice to Shift Control click on it and see it on the exterior. But in this case, it's working quite well simply to drag up that black flag. So let's go back to our camera view and take a closer look at some of our noise texture settings. So we can adjust the scale. If we go down, we're going to have larger cloud clumps as well as larger gaps in between. The detail size we want to be pretty high because one of the biggest drawbacks to Eevee is the limit we have on pixel resolution of the volumetric domain. And so we want to do whatever we can to get as highly detailed as possible. Also because real clouds are quite detailed. And so if we crank that up to at least 10, I don't usually see too much effect beyond a value of 10. We'll leave roughness as it is, and then distortion, if we hold shift and move this up, it has a very strong effect. So I like to go up slowly, and you can see that the clouds turn a little wispier once we get to like 0.1 and above. So I like 0.1, maybe 0.2, but these are settings that we will mess with a lot. And so we can adjust, we can bring down the white flag, and as we do, the clouds get a little more contrasty. They seem to thicken with volume. However, there's a bigger problem with the volume in that there seems to be no shadow information. It's just white clumps. And so there's really no depth information either. And by depth, I mean clouds that are further away versus closer to the camera. And the reason is our volume density. Even at a value of 1, it's not generating the type of thickness where the clouds will create shadows. So what I want to do is add a converter math node. And before I plug it into the network, I'm going to change the value to, or the operation to multiply and the second value to 1. Okay, so this is just taking the value of the color ramp and multiplying it by 1 or leaving it the exact same. But if I start to step this value up to a value of 2, it makes the clouds brighter. But if I go up to 5, we start to see some shadows getting involved. And even up to 10, the shadows get more distinct. So, moral of this lesson is for volumetric clouds, you're going to want your density to be much higher than what the default density value is. So if we change that to 10, it's the same principle. But here, we're starting to get shadows and the clouds have a structure. They have a depth to them. And so once we have that depth, we're going to need to step back and adjust our clouds. Adjust the cloud color ramp or adjust the scale. I actually think a value of 2, I like that. I don't want it to be too procedurally covering the frame. I want to see distinctly cloud covered spots and distinctly blue sky. So I think a value of 2 we'll leave for now. But at this point, I want to see what the actual render resolution looks like. Because in the preview, our clouds don't have enough detail. But once we go full resolution on the tile size, maybe it will be enough detail. So this is where we get to transitioning from preview to actual render. So whenever I want to do a final render, kind of an annoying habit you need to get into when it comes to volumetrics and Eevee is hit Z and switch to solid mode before changing your tile size to 2 and your samples to 256. If you don't switch away from rendered viewport mode, it's going to be a lot of work for your PC to keep up with the settings. And sometimes if your scene is very complex, it can be a significant slowdown. So I recommend switching to solid or wireframe view and then changing your settings to highest render quality. So before I render, I want to switch the resolution to be 50%. And now we'll render the image. And there we go, 2 seconds. That is great. The ability to get actual or approximated volumetrics that look decent in 2 seconds, that is honestly the only reason I have played around with clouds in Eevee. Doing this with cycles is significantly less fun. But what we get from this render is we still don't have enough detail in the clouds. It looks a little bit like a cheap procedural rather than believable cloud structure. So let's switch to slot 2 so we can see a progression. And I'm going to give you a sneak peek at the potential complexity of this workflow. By duplicating our noise texture, let's drag our object coordinates there. And what's wild about volumetrics and shader nodes in general is that we can use textures to manipulate the texture coordinates themselves. Okay, meaning the purple sockets, the 3D data that governs the texture. So if I add a color mix RGB, also before we get too far into this change, I want to switch back to preview settings. Remember I said this was annoying, so every time I jump back, I want to go to 4 pixels and then 128, just so that my viewport stays responsive. Though you'll certainly see me forget to update that at some point in the course. But we're going to use the color information from the second noise texture, and we're mixing it with the original texture coordinates. Now let's switch back to rendered view. And if we turn that on and off, you can see that it changes significantly, but there's also a lot more detail involved. And this ability is like cracking open Pandora's box for limitless cloud creativity. But we're just scratching the surface here. And we can change the operation of this mix. If we want to try overlay, and if we drag that up and down, you can see that this has a more subtle effect. And specifically, overlay, soft light, and linear light work well for taking the existing texture coordinates and just modifying them a little bit. You can see that the base structure stays pretty much the same, but then as you adjust the overlay influence, it modifies it slightly. Whereas if we use the mix node, it's completely swapping out these texture coordinates for the second slot. Okay, so that usually has a massive change. But we can, play around with it and find something that we like. I actually really like this cloud coverage. And so this is a good time to say this kind of project is going to work best if you're willing to get your hands dirty and play around, experiment. This is much less a science and more of a playtime, which I like to create that way. But you'll see that I like to favor certain operations. I rarely use mix, but in this case, it actually works pretty well. I often use multiply. Where is multiply? Right there. This one also does pretty well about maintaining the same shape and modifying it, but it does do it a little more drastically. But I'll especially use the multiply operation in the next cloud scene. But I've kind of forgotten that you also have the ability to adjust the settings on the noise texture, the second noise texture. So if we change the scale value up to 10, we're going to get a very small breakup, a small scale breakup of the clouds. You can also change the distortion to get a more distorted look, though at such a high scale value. Let's go back down to 2. Now you can see that the edge of the clouds are kind of spikier. They're kind of stretching out rather than just breaking up. So yeah, between these 3 nodes especially, there is tons of potential for adjusting the cloud structure. But for this particular example, I think I did like the mix value a little better because it gave me a broader range to choose from. I don't like the distortion so high. Let's go down to like a normal or more conservative value of like 0.2. And then let's find a different value of the mix. Where was it? I liked something like this. I think that looks pretty good. So let's say for now I'm happy with the cloud structure. What about the lighting? I'm seeing less shadows in the clouds. And before I adjust the density of the clouds, maybe moving the sunlight will help too. Okay, so I'm gonna make it more like facing the camera more directly. And we should get a little more of like a rim light effect on the clouds. I'm still not seeing a lot of shadow. So let's just double the density to 20. Okay, that looks pretty good. All right, when you don't have shadows involved, you're gonna see less of the detail from the noise textures. So it's good to have shadows present. Let's do a render of this and see where we stand. I'm gonna switch to solid view in the viewport and then change our tile size to 2, volumetric samples to 256, and let's render. Okay, switch back to the original. A lot more detailed than the original, but there are still a couple problems. I want to see a little bit more breakup of the clouds. Whoops. Let's bring that back. I want to see a little bit more breakup. Also the cloud shadows. This brings up an important point that they are not very blue. They're not inheriting a lot of the sky color, which is common for clouds to do since they are getting a lot of that fill light from the blue sky. You can see the shadows tend to inherit that blue value. It's weird to see white clouds in a blue sky with black shadows or desaturated gray. So the way I'm going to fix this, let's switch back to 4 pixels, 128 render samples. We're going to go to the world settings. We'll switch to rendered, and we're going to hack a solution. That's going to be a common theme when it comes to Eevee clouds, and frankly, a lot of stuff with Eevee, is that physical accuracy is not the priority. Rather, we just need to do whatever we need to do to make it look good. And in this case, we're going to duplicate the background so that we get a solid blue, okay? And then add an input light path node at the top, followed by a shader mix shader node. So before we deal with the mix shader, if I hit Shift Control click on this background, if I crank up the strength of this blue, and let's make it even more blue, and crank up the strength to like 3, it's kind of hard to tell, but our shadows are inheriting more of that color. It's hard to tell because the brightness of the actual world becomes so extreme that it kind of takes away from the shadow color, at least visually. So what I want to do is use this level of blue light in the scene, but I want the camera to see this, that gradient that we created. And the way you can do this is with the light path node. If I choose the is camera ray socket, plug it into the factor of the mix shader, then whatever is in the second slot will be seen in the camera, while whatever in the first slot is what's contributing to the scene. Okay, this is very much a CG fake hack. Okay, meaning you can't really do this in reality. But it's nice that we're able to do this because now I can adjust the strength of the first background, and you see that the color of the shadows is now blue. If we turn that off, they go back to black. Okay, so that's the practical slight tweak I want to make. And I think maybe a value of 5 is helping those clouds feel a little more natural in the blue sky. And then as far as the breakup, let's jump back to our object. We're still selected on the cloud object, so we can adjust. Let's see, we'll just play around with the settings, trying to see. Okay, so that's going to make it fill up a little bit more, but I want to break it up more as well. Maybe increase the scale to like 3, all right, of that second noise texture. Remember, this one's governing the incoming texture coordinates. So by increasing the scale, it's going to make the breakup finer, and that already starts to look more like our image. Yeah, I think I'm actually pretty happy with that. So let's hope that this is the final render for this first lesson. Switch to solid view, make sure that I pick a new render slot, slot number 3, and then tile size at 2, samples at 256, and render. And let's see the before and after. So it's a pretty big jump. The cloud structure changed a lot, but this is going to be okay for now. I still would like to tweak it a little bit more, but we're going to revisit the project in a later lesson. But as far as understanding the fundamental workflow of volumetric clouds in Eevee, you should be quite familiar with that at this point. And we can take a break from this project and jump over to a more complex cumulus cloud.